I want to tell you about the most famous Latter-day Saint woman of the 1950s that you've likely never heard of. A woman who was voted as one of the top 10 most important women by the LA Times, who mingled with Marilyn Monroe, and who established an international multi-million-dollar fashion design company, but who was also a powerful disciple of Christ, who counseled with apostles on how to better approach missionary work, who redesigned the temple garment for women, and who established a relationship between Jewish and Latter-day Saint faiths, influencing how we do interfaith dialogue today. On top of it, she was a loving mother of 3, a faithful church member, and a powerful missionary. Speaking to a group of students in 1953, this woman said, quote, "Tell everyone you meet that you are a Mormon, and then live it to the utmost of your ability," end of quote. One individual who heard her speak about the church said, quote, "I only heard what you said about Mormonism, and the way you said it. If an angel had come down straight from heaven, I couldn't have been more impressed," end of quote. So who is this amazing person you've likely never heard of? Her name is Rose Marie Reid. How is it that so few Latter-day Saints have heard of her? How does a woman born in the tiny Canada town of Cardston and raised in the rural spaces of Weiser, Idaho, become one of the most influential and successful Latter-day Saint businesswomen of her time? That's what Professor Andrew Reid from Brigham Young University's Department of Church History and Doctrine has investigated, researched, and published on.
To have somebody who is so committed to her business success, so committed to her children, and so committed to helping the church figure out how to do this well, it's amazing how much she was able to accomplish and the kind of success she had in all of these areas.
Although Rose Marie Reid may have been atypical for her time period, she provides a great model for many of us in our time, showing that a woman can build a family, build a business, build faith, and build the kingdom. So get ready to learn about one of the most fascinating women you've likely never heard of, and why you will never forget her. I'm Professor Anthony Sweat, and this is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, Professor Casey Griffiths from the Department of Church History and Doctrine sat down with his colleague, Professor Andrew Reid, by the way, no relation to Rose Marie Reid, also from Church History and Doctrine, to talk about his research publication on Rose Marie Reid. In part 1, Professor Reid will talk about Rose Marie Reid's life, the development of her company, her family, and her business and church success. In part 2, he'll move a little bit more specifically about how Rose Marie Reid influenced and revolutionized missionary work, interfaith dialogue, particularly with the Jewish community, and what lessons we can learn today in our own interfaith dialogue and missionary work. And in part 3, he'll tell us a little bit more about his academic journey and his faith. So here's Professor Casey Griffiths interviewing his colleague, Professor Andrew Reid, about his research and publications on Rose Marie Reid.
All right, Andy, thanks for being here today. And this is a really interesting story that you've written about. It involves Latter-day Saints and Jewish people. Men and women swimsuits are part of the story too. And it takes place at kind of a unique period of time, post-World War II, where a lot of conceptions and ideas about how people saw different religions, especially Jews, were changing. Tell us a little bit about how you came to this story and why you decided to write about it.
Sure. I started looking at the story in part because there was a display that was on at the Harold Bealey Library at BYU,
Mm-hmm.
and it had to do with Rose Marie Reid's story. Had her swimsuits on display, had some of the artifacts from this new collection that the library had just gained from the family. And so as I started looking at it, I realized there was a strong interfaith component to it, which is something I've been working on since I got here at BYU. And I started looking into some of the details just out of interest and started talking to John Murphy, who's at the library, one of the curators, and he was kind of describing some of the collection that they had. And there's just mountains of resources there from her personal papers, from her business papers and things like that. And so I started looking into it. And what really intrigued me was, as somebody who studies modern Judaism, there was a strong sort of Jewish overlay in a lot of this. And she spent part of her life, at least, in a very small town in Idaho, which is where my mother grew up. And so I was kind of interested in how that played out. And really just kind of was sort of taken by the massive influence this woman had within the church and also in the world. And so I was interested in writing about a Latter-day Saint woman who was one of the most successful business people in the 1950s and 60s, and wanted to kind of learn more about the story and see what was there. And as I dug a little bit deeper, I kept just finding more and more information that was just an intriguing and kind of a compelling narrative.
Now, for our listeners, I doubt very many of them know who Rose Marie Reid is. Even though, like you said, she's a very successful businesswoman. She's one of the most successful swimsuit designers of the 20th century, which surprised me. Can you give us kind of a brief biographical sketch of Rose Marie Reid, even that little Idaho town that she comes from? Because I'm sure someone out there will be interested in that.
Absolutely. So she's born in Canada, and about the time that she's 10, she moves to Weiser, Idaho.
Weiser is the name of the town.
Yes.
Okay.
And, I spent my summers growing up in Weiser, and it was just a kind of idyllic little Idaho town. And so when I found out that she was from there, I was just completely amazed by this and wanted to learn more.
Weezer's also my favorite 90s band.
Yes,
I
right.
should mention. Yeah.
You and Buddy Holly, right? No, but, there's this narrative here of Rose Marie Reid kind of coming from a very small town in which she becomes something against all odds. She's married a couple of times early on, and has a couple of small children, and these marriages end. So by the time her second marriage ends, she decides she's going to move to California and try and make something of herself, and does so through the garment business. And she is, starts off with a very small group of people, at most maybe 15, 16 employees, and they start making these swimsuits. And fairly quickly these things take off, and they begin, by the time her company reaches the height of its production, they're making somewhere around 10,000 suits a day. And you can still find some of her swimsuits, at least the label, you can still find them for sale today. But that she is outfitting some of the movie stars. And so she kind of has this incredible story, and she becomes this woman of kind of incredible importance for Los Angeles and Hollywood. And all of this emerges out of this kind of very difficult personal life that she's had through her marriages and raising young children.
Yeah, one of the interesting things I found in the article about her is that she doesn't fit the mold of a mid-20th century Latter-day Saint lady. She's divorced twice, as she works in the fashion industry. You mentioned she has little children. Like, how is she managing to balance all this?
Well, the stories are quite incredible. I did interviews with her daughter, Carol, with her niece, Claire, and had opportunities to sort of sit down with them and ask some of these questions, because there really is this compelling narrative here about this woman who, against all odds, becomes incredibly successful. And it seems that she does so just by not sleeping, quite frankly. They talk about how she would take, these 1-hour naps on the floor in her office at the factory, or how she would just sort of work through the entire night and seemingly could just do this over and over and over again. And so in some ways it's this story of just really hard work and dedication. And there are ups and downs along the way, of course. But it seems as though she just sort of has this love for being busy and turns that into, creating this sort of fashion empire. But then there's also this other component where she finds ways and outlets for her faith to become central to her identity as well.
Yeah. And when we say successful, I should mention in the article, you list some of the people that she designs for. The list includes Rita Hayworth, Jane Russell, Marilyn Monroe. She has her swimsuits featured in Gidget, which is one of my wife's favorite movies. Muscle Beach Party, Where the Boys Are. I mean, this is sort of amazing that it's not more well known, because it seems like she was in the center of American popular culture in the 50s and 60s. And yet she's been largely overlooked.
And she's winning awards from Sports Illustrated for Designer of the Year and these kinds of things, right? And so the Los Angeles Times names her as one of the 10 most important women of, I can't remember the exact year, but in the 1950s. And so she is incredibly popular and well-known. But it's a story that there's sort of two parallel stories that happen here. Mm-hmm. She has a deep interest in church history, and also in obviously the Jewish narrative and modern Judaism with the rise of the state of Israel and things like that. And so there's these sort of two parts of her life that don't seem to cross all that often. And yet, as we started unpacking this story, you just see this kind of richness of her personal narrative, of her desire to learn and to know and to have influence. All of that comes together.
Yeah. And it seems like sometimes we have this mental separation of the world and the church, and she was comfortable kind of going back and forth. In fact, one of her swimsuits was sold specifically to raise funds for the Los Angeles Temple. Is that right?
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
So she does have this ability to sort of leverage what she's doing in business to be a major contribution to the building of the kingdom, as she sees it. So she does design a swimsuit and has women from the Relief Society helping sew some of these as a way to raise funds for the temple. Eventually she'll move to Provo, Utah, and as an effort to help raise funds for the temple here in Provo, along with some of the buildings here on campus, she begins giving tours of her home. And, there's ads in the paper there, you can show up and you can go tour Reid's home, and you can see kind of the life of a very famous designer. And then she's giving those funds over to the church and to the university here to, kind of build up the kingdom in that way. So she has this very generous element of her where she wants to give back. And for her, that's just part of what she does. That's part of her responsibility in a way.
Let me ask, what's her connection to the Jewish community? How come she seems to be so intensely interested in them and helping reach out to them?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that as Jesse King, one of the co-authors here, an undergraduate student here at BYU, and I were working through this, we started visiting with John Murphy, and as we started looking at some of the collection, we realized that there's a sort of family lore about a deep Jewish connection. It's a tenuous connection, it seems, but it's there. And so for her, she sees both a sort of personal investment in her own family history in a way, and also just a deep interest in this. And it's hard to explain where the interest really comes from. But as you look at at her children, as you look at her niece especially, there's these connections that emerge over time.
Now, her niece is married to a young man who's Jewish,
yes.
Correct? Eugene.
Yes, Eugene.
Uh-huh.
And they live here in Provo. I did an interview with them. As part
they're still
here.
alive.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
wow.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that Eugene was telling me is, upon their first meeting, she, as Rose Marie Reid learns that he's Jewish, she sits down with him and starts having these long conversations. These become the framework for her pamphlet that she writes, and is trying to help. Here's how it. So he said it was kind of very in your face and aggressive in some ways. Wasn't really holding back from that, because she really wanted him to see what she was what the church was offering here. And they happen to meet during this period when they're having these, when she's doing this work to develop this pedagogical framework for how to approach Jews and introduce them to the church and to the history of the Book of Mormon, to eventually to Jesus Christ. And so there's this really interesting way in which she begins to do this, and she does it by developing personal relationships. There are countless stories from people who knew her when she would show up at a dinner party, and she would sit down with them and she would start scribbling on the napkin things that they needed to know. Mm-hmm. And her approach really is to build a set of common bonds by focusing on the Hebrew Bible and the kind of narrative of covenant, and then from there enlarging that narrative to include the Book of Mormon.
I'm surprised too. You include some excerpts from her book in here, and I am surprised at the frankness of the dialogue. This is post-World War II, post-Holocaust, and one of the conversations you include, can I read an excerpt from it? She writes, "Do you see, Eugene," this is her son-in-law, "that it also explains one of the first things you said to me when we began to talk. You said, would God direct Hitler to kill 6 million people whose only crime was that of being Jewish? Other Jewish people have said to me, if there's a just God, why would he permit Hitler to kill all those innocent people? Where's the justice in that? But God cannot prevent Hitler from doing it. Can you understand that God would not take away from Hitler the right to think for himself any more than he can take that right away from you? Hitler had fought with us in the pre-existence for that kind of right." Now that is intense dialogue. And you can see her interjecting this Latter-day Saint belief in agency as it explains the problem of evil to a Jewish person. But boy, if those are the kind of conversations they're having, it must have been an interesting dinner table to sit around, to say the least.
Certainly, the way she does everything in life, it seems, is through this kind of just very frank openness to having the conversation. I think part of that comes from her place in the business world. She has to be, I don't think aggressive is the right word, but she has to be ambitious. Mm-hmm. And she has to get things done because she has very little time, and she's trying to do so many things that when she has an opportunity to push this idea that she really wants Jews to see the connections between the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and their own personal, collective narratives here, she wants them to get right to the point in most cases.
Yeah.
There's a few places where she holds back a little bit and says and she's trying to outline for individuals who will be sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with their Jewish neighbors and friends. She says, you've got to be careful. You can't just introduce Jesus up front, right? You've got to slowly get there. Mm-hmm. You've got to build a common set of beliefs and ideas before you can really do that. I think today in the missionary world, you'd call this building relationships of trust or something, right? You've got to find a place where you have common abilities. But there's some places like that passage you just read where she's taking on some very controversial things, and it's interesting that this is all happening in the decade before and right around the Catholic Church's effort with Vatican II and this document called Nostra Aetate, in which they suggest to Catholics that there's a different way to teach Judaism and teach the history of the Old Testament and the New Testament that doesn't have to place Jews as a faith that is gone. But really kind of rethinking the place of Jesus in that context of the New Testament of a Jewish context. But with Hitler here, she's doing something that I think most of us, and I certainly felt this, was somewhat offensive in a way, just because of my own interest in thinking about the history of anti-Semitism and other places where I've been working on this project for a long time. She gets right to the point and says, Hitler had agency, which is a very Latter-day Saint way of thinking. But it runs afoul of some of the kind of more popular conservative approaches to the history of the Holocaust. But she's not going to back away from that.
Yeah.
Right? She wants people to see that there are ways to explain what happened.
Yeah. In fact, I don't want to leave out the second paragraph that you included because the last sentence was, well, Hitler has free agency, so what are you going to do? The next thing she says is, there is justice in God's plan. Evil men will be punished in full measure, and those who suffered innocently will have the compensation in full measure in the next world. Can't you see, Eugene, there has to be another world to have time to even things up. Your idea that few can have immortality and the memories of the living is not enough. Surely you do not think that Hitler's last few days of realization that he had lost the war and the manner of his death were punishment enough for what he did. I should think that you would be glad here that there is an eternity that those innocent sufferers can enjoy their reward in eternity. So she's using this Latter-day Saint conception of the afterlife, which is huge in our theology, to try and bridge the gap that a Jewish person might see in how unfair the Holocaust was and how there's compensation as long as you believe in an afterlife, if that makes sense.
She wants them to see that God's covenant must somehow be intact for the people with whom God originally made a covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And even though we've had this long history of hostility towards Jews, they are still a chosen people, his chosen people. And to have that play out in a modern context, post-Holocaust, for her suggests the inevitability that God will redeem his people,
mm-hmm.
as promised through Scripture. And for her, the restored gospel is the way in which that happens. And it's she has an incredible ability to say very controversial things and have people still like her.
Yeah.
Right? Which I wish all of us had that ability.
I was reading this and
ways.
thinking, I don't think I could have pulled this off, or I don't think I would have had the courage to even bring it up. But she just seemed to have this way of, like you said, cutting to the heart of the matter and immediately wanting to discuss things that people tiptoe around, but that she felt like we need to have a real conversation about this.
And as somebody who's writing about this, I think Jesse and John and I all felt that we had to tiptoe at times, because it is a very difficult narrative. The way that she encourages this teaching, and the part of the story that was most compelling to me was the fact that she meets LeGrand Richards in the early 50s, and he's already been working on a project, Israel Do You Know,
Mm-hmm.
and is teaching or kind of developing a way of thinking about the rise of modern Israel as a state,
Mm-hmm.
and is trying to place that in a context of the restored gospel. And so he's going and he's getting these pamphlets that are being provided by the state of Israel, kind of almost like brochures for tourism,
Mm-hmm.
in a sense, right? Or brochures about the economic development of this new state. And remember that in the early 50s, this is a period when the state of Israel its existence is questionable,
Yeah.
in terms of a long-term project. And so he is trying to place this in a space that Latter-day Saints can understand that this is God working, right? This is God's work in the world. He's beginning to unroll this next stage of the covenant. And so LeGrand Richards is writing about this and kind of giving a description about how Jerusalem is once again blossoming as a rose, right? And there's this kind of incredible economic project that's going on. And she picks up on this as they start talking, and there's this almost immediate bond between these two individuals. And it's an unlikely bond, I suppose. But over the next decade or so, she will begin having opportunities to write letters to general authorities, First Presidency.
Mm-hmm.
She's invited to come and give sort of introductions to her approach to teaching the gospel to Jews.
And she and Elder Richards, who's one of the most famous missionaries of the
course.
20th century, writes a marvelous work and a wonder and just a whole library of important missionary work, developed this systematized way of teaching the gospel at a time when there really isn't one. There's no preach by gospel, no discussions. Right. They're sort of the vanguard when it comes to this.
And that's another part of the story that to me is so fascinating, that as incredible as LeGrand Richards is as a Latter-day Saint missionary and his, the writings that he's doing and things like that, as important as those are to that broader world of missionary work, he's looking to her as a model to say, okay, here's somebody who's thinking deeply about not just the message, but how the message is portrayed and how the message is relayed to this person who's hearing it for the first time. Because she has these, there's different drafts of this pamphlet that she's putting out, and she has visuals that she uses and all these kind of pamphlets that she will provide to people. And you can kind of see her as you look at the chronological development of these. You can see her working through this, and she tests them out, and if it fails, she goes back and rethinks it. Mm-hmm. It's like, to me, she's a model of a good teacher. Mm-hmm. You try something out, and if it fails, you scrap it, or you modify it. And she's doing this constantly. And I think that's part of what LeGrand Richards and others find most compelling about the way she's doing this, is she's thinking seriously about marketing, in a sense, right? How do you market the message? Mm-hmm. Because the things she's saying are, as you pointed out, they're challenging things to hear. But she's trying to figure out, how do we do it well?
Right. How do we build on common beliefs rather than just kind of barrel in and shove the Book of Mormon into a person's face?
Right. It's a fascinating approach. And to have somebody who is so committed to her business success, so committed to her children, and so committed to helping the church figure out how to do this well, it's amazing how much she was able to accomplish and the kind of success she had in all of these areas. As I've had a chance to visit with her daughter and with her niece and with Eugene, all of them talk about how she just wouldn't give up, right? It was never good enough. And not in a negative way, just to say that she always wanted to do more. She always wanted to provide something else for people that would be comforting, that would be helpful, that would build the kingdom. And she was willing to risk everything in some ways to make sure that happened.
If you're interested in more peer-reviewed, high-quality gospel scholarship about Latter-day Saint history, doctrine, or practice, such as this publication, BYU's Religious Studies Center is a great place to check out. Today, I want to turn you on to a new publication that, frankly, is a little self-serving. It's a book publication called Repicturing the Restoration by myself, Anthony Sweat. While existing artwork that portrays the Restoration is rich and beautiful, until now, many key events of church history have never been depicted or haven't been depicted according to the historical record. The purpose of this book project that I recently completed after 6 years of work is to produce 25 paintings of some of the underrepresented events of the Restoration in order to expand our understanding of the Restoration. Each image includes a richly researched historical background, some artistic insights into the painting's composition, and an application section providing one way that this history may inform our present faith. As an author, artist, and church history and doctrine professor, I want these paintings to be able to take the reader through a timeline of church history and doctrine of pivotal events of the early Restoration. I hope that this book is not just a wonderful art book, although it can be that. I want it to be a pedagogical book using art as a launching pad to learn, evaluate, apply, and discuss important aspects of Latter-day Saint history and doctrine as you repicture the Restoration. Again, the book is called Repicturing the Restoration by me, Anthony Sweat. Check it out and pick it up at rsc.byu.edu. We've been listening to Professor Casey Griffiths interview his colleague Andrew Reid about his research on the amazing and fascinating woman Rose Marie Reid. In part 2, Professor Reid will talk about how Rose Marie Reid revolutionized missionary work, how she worked with the Jewish community, and how her missionary efforts set a pattern and changed the way we approach missionary work and interfaith dialogue today, lessons that are great for all of us to learn from. So here's Professor Griffiths and Professor Reid.
To me, it's interesting that this isn't happening as a retirement project. This is at the height of her career, when she must have been incredibly busy with all these other things, but she seems like she is really focused on coming up with this unified approach to teaching the gospel. And it's probably not a coincidence that around the same time the church does produce the first systematized. What influence does she have on this systematic approach to teaching the gospel that the church eventually adopts?
Well, it's hard to track some of that, although it's clear that she's been invited into conversations with individuals who are part of the missionary committee for the church, who are thinking seriously about how do we present our message broadly to everyone. Now, of course, she's focused on a particular group of people that she thinks needs this message right away. She's compelled by the rise of the State of Israel and sees this as the dawning of a new day, I think. And so she's focused her missionary efforts towards Jews. But I think people are taking notice. Gordon B. Hinckley is around. Thomas S. Monson is looking at what she's producing.
There's letters between
them, right?
Yeah.
He provides her a kind of quote for what it would cost for Deseret Deseret News to publish her pamphlet, right? Which in 1950s dollars is a substantial sum. She's self-publishing that, right? But she does have, it's clear that there's some working models that she's providing to them that at least serve as a framework for how to do this, not just for Jews, but for the world. So she's having a conversation with all of the interested parties, as opposed to just with LeGrand Richards, right? Now, he obviously is a major connection for her and they're very, very good friends.
Yeah, they have
right?
this
just
remarkable
this incredible friendship.
Yeah.
And you can see just dozens and dozens of letters back and forth to each other. And it's clear they know about each other's families, and they know, the troubles that each other has in terms of health and things like that. But they're always, he's always trying to get her in front of the audience that needs to hear what she's offering. And I think that's a really beautiful thing that we sometimes forget.
I want to point out an excerpt from one of their letters, and maybe use that to apply to our listeners. LeGrand Richards wrote to her, and he said, "It is going to take some time to train our people so they will not make the mistakes of saying things that could be offensive to our Jewish friends. They do not really hold anything against the Jewish people, I am sure. The mistakes they make, meaning the Latter-day Saints, are because of bad habits formed." Now, as someone that has spent your academic career working with people of other faiths, especially Jewish people, what are some of the mistakes that we still make that we could help people understand when talking to a person of the Jewish faith? You should do this, you should not do this. Here's some language that could be sensitive. Here's some things that might help bridge the gap.
Absolutely. This is an important point, and this is part of why I was really compelled by her story. She does say things that to a 21st century listener are offensive. There's no doubt about that. But she's always trying to figure out how the listener hears what she says. And she's willing to change at that point when she finds out that something she has said has been offensive. She doesn't back away from her beliefs. She holds her commitments close, but is open about her commitments. So you would never see her coming in and not telling people what she thought. She was very direct. And I think that's important. When we do interfaith work, we have to stand by our commitments. But at the same time, we have to have a kind of openness to other people. As we've been part of about the same time that this article came out, we started a Jewish Latter-day Saint dialogue with academics from BYU, from Hebrew Union College, the Academy of Jewish Religion, and it's been this fruitful dialogue that's gone on now for about 4 years. We were just recently in Jerusalem, and we've learned through that process of a couple of years about how to do this well, I think. And we're but you brought up this question of what are the things that we do wrong? Well, sometimes we just insist upon the things we know as being the only things available. And what I mean by that is that we sometimes declare our faith as the only way God is working in the world. And I'm always amazed that, if we can be a little bit more generous in the way we approach people of other faiths, if we can use Christopher Stendhal's notion of holy envy, can we go in and study someone else's faith as an honest endeavor to learn what they're offering the world?
Right. It feels like the impulse to always talk about how our faith is superior to other people's faiths reveals a little bit of insecurity on our part. On the other hand, being willing to see something in another faith and say, that's beautiful, that's that's God's hand at work, shows that we're a little bit secure with what we believe and that we're comfortable with the idea that God works in a lot of different ways throughout the world.
Yeah, and I think, and in some ways, one of the things that she did for the church, and probably maybe one of the most important things, isn't just the proselytizing. But I think for interfaith work to the way I see interfaith work happening in the church is we're building bridges, right? We're not insisting upon conversion. And in some ways, we're not even focusing on conversion.
Yeah.
But rather, we're trying to understand and we're trying to be understood.
You're the advisor to the Interfaith Club on campus here, which
Yes.
has been a really successful club. Could you explain to our listeners, we're so focused on conversion, and absolutely we should be. The Savior commanded us to preach the gospel.
Right.
What's the value in an interfaith dialogue where you fundamentally start out saying, I'm not trying to convert you. I want to listen to what you have to say. What do you see as the value of that to us and how it helps us?
Well, I think one of the values of interfaith work is that we build relationships. In the 21st century, religious communities need partners. Just recently, we took part of our dialogue team up to Welfare Square in Salt Lake City, and we showed them the Bishop's Central Storehouse, and we showed them, the employment center and things like that. And they were struck by the good that we're doing and the amount of just food and clothing and things that we're able to pull together because of the structure of the church and because of the areas of emphasis where we've said the church can do a lot of good in these areas. But one of the things that was made quite clear as we were visiting with those senior missionaries and others who were running those centers is that we're always seeking partners to do our humanitarian work. We're always seeking partners to take care of the homeless, right? We're not trying to do it on our own. And oftentimes I find in interfaith circles, when somebody has an opportunity to know more about what the church does in terms of humanitarian work and things like that, they always say, why don't you advertise this more? Why aren't you telling people what's going on? We had missionary Baptist preachers here from Southern California several years ago, and they kept saying, you guys do something no one else is doing. Why don't you tell people about it? And the answer that the individuals who have responsibility for these programs, the answer they gave was, we don't want people to know, right? We want to find the partners, and we want to find what's going to work best in terms of getting the care to the people we need. And so interfaith work does a central part of that in terms of building those networks, in terms of finding partners who are interested in solving some of the same problems we are. And yes, we have a strong missionary program. And yes, that missionary program is essential to the work we do. And it's, as you said, right, it's commanded by Scripture. At the same time, our reach as a church has so much more breadth when we can find ways to help people live better, right? Whether that's through taking care of them, during a natural disaster, whether it's through providing wheelchairs, whether it's through providing food for refugees and others. And I think part of our central mission as a church, and part of our divine commission, in a sense, as a church, is to care for the poor, is to care for the needy, individuals who don't have what they need. And the work of, I always look at interfaith work as just a part of that project, right? Where we're building relationships where who knows what comes of it, right? But as we go into when I show up at a table of, an interfaith circle, and we sit down and our first declaration is, we are not here to convert you. I think people are taken back by that because that's not the normal thing they hear, right? Latter-day Saints are very good about saying, hey, church starts at 9:00. Will you please join me?
Yeah.
And I think in order for interfaith work to be successful, we have to step away from that a little bit, right? We still live the life of faith. We still participate in our life of faith with those people that we're doing interfaith work with. We've invited rabbis to speak in sacrament meeting, right? Which is not your usual Sunday morning sermon, but they've participated in Sunday school lessons, and we've gone into their synagogues. They've allowed us to speak there, and we've had great opportunities to really kind of build a deep, deep friendship with the individuals we're working with specifically, but also with their communities. And it's been it can be a really kind of fulfilling process as you learn to see someone else's life of faith and appreciate it.
If you want to learn more about this fascinating research on Rose Marie Reid, go to whyreligion.byu.edu, where we've given links where you can download Professor Reid's research on Rose Marie Reid. We've also provided a link to an exhibit that was done at the Harold B. Lee Library, where you can see photographs of Rose Marie Reid, her swimsuit designs, and other great things to learn about her life. And remember that if you want to connect with us at Why Religion, comment and give your insights on episodes you've listened to, see some behind-the-scenes photos and get bonus material, give us a follow on Instagram at Why Religion Podcast. Okay, we've arrived at part 3 of Why Religion, where we like to talk with the professor about why the professor chose to be a religious educator, why they believe, and why they choose faith. So we wrap up this episode with Professor Andrew Reid sharing a little bit about his academic and faith journey.
Now, tell me a little bit about yourself and how you came to this. I know just from conversations we've had that you've had a varied career. At one point, you were driving for a mortuary or something like that.
I was a funeral director for a while.
You were a funeral director for a little while. So give us a rough sketch about how you came into religious ed and how you stay grounded in the faith in the midst of all the great work that you do outside of our faith.
Well, people ask me this question, I suppose, with some frequency, and the answer is I don't really know how I got here in some ways. I was a student here at BYU, and I was interested in history and English, and I was studying for the LSAT, and I was planning to go to law school, and a professor, during a conversation I had with him, said, have you considered looking at going to do a master's degree? Because he knew my interest in history, and he knew that I was sort of conflicted about whether law school or going into the academic world was what I wanted to do. And he said, well, have you considered doing a master's degree? So I did a master's degree in England, and it was in linguistics and history. So it wasn't connected at all to the study of religion. But during that project that I was working on there, I sort of kept running into Jewish communities historically in terms of the documents I was looking at. And I just didn't know enough to really know what was there. But I was interested in learning more about Judaism and about Eastern European Jewish communities, because I knew a little bit about the Holocaust, and I wanted to understand what that community was before the Holocaust. And so I took a second master's degree in Jewish and Christian relations. And that just sort of catapulted me in terms of my interest in religion. And during my PhD program at Arizona State, I was always working in that interfaith realm because I was writing about the history of anti-Semitism, and I was thinking about how Jews and Christians in 19th and 20th century Russia cooperated and oftentimes didn't cooperate. And even then, not that many years ago, this was not the place I was thinking I was going to land here at BYU. It just wasn't ever really on the career path. But along the way, I had various jobs. I wrote for a newspaper for a little while. I was a funeral director in California, and doing all those things that we do to pay for school. But as I was doing that, I was having interfaith opportunities. I was selling ads for a newspaper one time, and I went into a car dealership, and the owner of the dealership was a Sikh. And I had opportunities to sit down with him, and as I was selling ads and we were talking, and I learned a little bit about his faith and he learned a little bit about mine. Just by chance, I ended up at Westminster Abbey with some very important interfaith leaders, including Jonathan Sacks, including the Prince of Jordan, and just sort of saw this world out there that I'd never seen in terms of work that religious communities do when they're not trying to proselyte, but when they're just trying to build bridges, and was completely enamored by this whole thing. And so it sort of became a thing that I wanted to figure out how to do. And of course, along the way, incredible failures and some successes along the way as well. And so to me, ending up here at Brigham Young University in religious education, it feels like a place I'm supposed to be. But it was never the place I thought I would.
It was
end.
never the plan.
Right. It was never really where I thought I was going.
Yeah.
But I think certain things have happened in terms of interfaith work for the church in the past decade that have opened up opportunities for us here, as you have with your own experience. We're doing things with other communities in ways we've really never done before. And it's an important part of what the church is trying to do right now. And so I see the university playing a central role in that, because this is where, as academics, we have the opportunity to kind of further that work in our own way. It's not exactly what the church is doing, but it's part of the background of that. And so I think it's an interesting development that's happened in the past decade or so.
Now, does someone similar to you, let's say an undergrad or a master's student, that hears this and thinks, interfaith sounds like something that I could do, what advice would you give to them right now? What sort of classes to take, and what sort of experiences should they be searching for?
Well, Jessie King was an undergraduate student when we co-authored this article together. Mm-hmm. And she had taken a world religions class and was interested in that. She was also interested in fashion. And so she found a way to marry those two projects.
Those aren't two things
Rose Marie
that you
Reid.
automatically assume
No, exactly, right?
match up.
But she found a way through our joint research here to kind of marry those two projects together. And so I think you can look for opportunities. There are professors on this campus who are doing all kinds of work in interfaith areas. Some of it's theological, some of it is in terms of communication, some of it is just sort of projects that weren't designed to be interfaith but have an interfaith component. And so look for opportunities to be involved in those things.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of religious education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat. I'm the executive producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes, from Brigham Young University, professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, and Ryan Sharp. Recording and mixing were done by BYU students Mitchell Bashford and Connor Miller. Say hi, Mitchell and Connor.
Hey guys.
Hi.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and
Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.